If you're familiar with my game, you know I've listened to an album or two at this point in my life. Truthfully, I've never heard a record that sounds like Ween's Quebec. Both sonically and lyrically, this is truly one of the most unique albums I've ever heard. It's hard to even really categorize. It's got ambient tracks, it's got punkish tracks, acoustic rock tracks, weird fucked up electronic tracks. It's genuinely incomparable to anything else I've ever heard. Today I'd like to attempt to explain the sheer madness that ensues on this record, a record that tells many interesting tales, some harrowing, some outright concerning. Without further ado, let's dive into the first track. It's gonna be a long night. Can't say this is my favorite song of all time, quite honestly, not by a long shot. But as an album opener, I'm not sure I've heard many songs get the job done better. It slingshots you into this record, no foreplay, no introduction. The project begins with this burst of intensity and immediately tells you that this project will be unlike anything you've ever heard from Ween. It's perhaps the most straightforward song on the album sonically, fairly standard rock song here. Some heavy guitar, some loud drums, and Gene Ween kind of screaming at you. Lyrically, it's far from the most introspective song on the project, but it introduces one of the themes of this record quite well, and that is the theme of addiction. Like I said, not too much to tackle here lyrically, but it begins the record's tale of addiction with a sense of urgency to it, as though the protagonist here is already fully aware of what the drugs are turning him into. Give me that Zoloft. Track 2 takes a completely different turn. If I'd describe the opener as a heavy rock track, I'd call this one a more psychedelic ballad of sorts. The title of the track here is, of course, in reference to a drug known as Zoloft, a relatively standard drug used to treat depression, OCD, PTSD, and other assorted mental disorders. The song begins with the narrator taking Zoloft and immediately feeling better, as antidepressants occasionally do. He can feel it going into his system, numbing his own pain in a way, and that concept is reflected in this kind of second vocal style present throughout the majority of this track. Most of the vocals here are conveyed in a very standard Gene tone, but underneath those vocals lies a far more submerged voice. A voice that seems to be the voice inside of the narrator's head. The voice tells him that the Zoloft is merely creating an illusion of the world around him, completely masking reality from him. As the song progresses, this voice becomes more present. It goes from a voice kind of only present in the bridge to a voice underlying his own thoughts in the verse. The voice in his head tells him that this can't be the solution to his problems, that although they give him peace, they've completely taken over him as a person. It's telling him that life is hard, regardless of what you're going through, but taking a drug to fix it isn't going to just make those problems vanish, far from it. It'll lessen those problems perhaps, but it's his job to fix those problems, to use the Zoloft as a tool to overcome his own illnesses. A harrowing track in complete context, to be honest, but far from the most harrowing on the project, for sure. Transdermal Celebration, onto maybe just the greatest song of all time, I'm not sure. The psychedelic ballad takes a backseat to a relatively indescribable song. It's got rock elements, I suppose, but it's far more grand than that to me. It's neo-psychedelia meeting rock, if I had to classify it. I suppose first we should tackle the big words in the title. A transdermal celebration is not an actual thing, I don't think. The word transdermal means the act of applying a drug or medicine through the skin. The transdermal celebration would thus perhaps be an incredibly intense drug-induced experience, or in a completely different context, the aftermath of kind of nuclear fallout. I'll circle back to that, don't worry. For both interpretations here, the song begins with reality kind of falling apart, whether drug-induced or an actual nuclear bomb. The second verse continues to describe his nuclear fallout, a crust of green overtaking the world, a reference to the first nuclear bomb test over at Los Alamos, NM, that turned the sand it landed on into glass stained with green radiation. Weird shit. A tidal wave overtaking the land, trees being torn to shreds, and the tectonic plates shaking from the aftermath. The next line describes the narrator growing with the land, which in the drug context makes a lot of sense. Weird shit happens on drugs. And he seems to find peace within this fallout in a way. The chorus begins as the narrator looks into the distance and sees the nuclear bomb just a million miles away, or maybe a billion, I don't know. He lays on the lawn, perhaps finding peace in his own demise. The next line is when the morning ray hits his face, which is quite honestly a transdermal celebration, as the sun is a star powered by nuclear fusion. The rays of the sun would hit him, and as they pass through his skin would incite a transdermal celebration, something like that. The next verse begins as jets soar through the skies, leaving trails of flames behind them. The protagonist searches for someone he describes as a mutation, which makes way more sense in the drug context, I think. It sounds like a friend told him he'd be fine, that these drugs wouldn't change his life in any way, and as this nuclear fallout ensues, that friend's nowhere to be found. The song concludes with the narrator once again basking in this nuclear light. He lays on the lawn as he perhaps accepts his fate, to either be destroyed by this nuclear warfare or perhaps to be destroyed by some drug-induced experience, ego death, if you would. Cool song, I like it. Among His Tribe. Off of that neo-psychedelic rock track, we head into a more desolate, ambient-style track. Perhaps its soundscope is intended to provide a view into the nuclear fallout we just heard take place on Transdermal Celebration. Or in the drug context, perhaps the protagonist is beginning to come down. Lyrically, it seems to tell a story from the distant past, a tribesman going about his day, pretty much. But honestly, not too much to tackle here. Very few lyrics on this track, and none of them really leave me with much to chew on. The only interesting tidbit I was able to find is in regards to the line, "He used the flesh to feed the youth, he'd salt it down." Mr. Gene Ween said he drew inspiration of salting for preservation. He said it was done for thousands and thousands of years. Salted cod was a big one for sailors and explorers still eating today. Salt it, smoke it, save it for later. My headcanon here is that the song is supposed to discuss self-preservation in both contexts, about survival and perseverance kind of through struggle. That's all I got, sorry. So Many People in the Neighborhood. Sonically, perhaps the most Ween song on the record, or at the very least the most reminiscent of something you'd find off of something like Pure Guava. From the dark ambient track, we head into a relatively indescribable one. If I had to classify it, I suppose it's the kind of twisted dark electronic track. But again, there's no real way to do it. To me, the entire track comes across as incredibly paranoid and almost schizophrenic. And I think the instrumentation here backs that idea really well. It's very all over the place, very robust and almost industrial at points. Lyrically, he says "so many people in the neighborhood" a bunch of times, and typically ends the verse with the phrase, "I don't know if they're very good people." That's where the idea of paranoia seems to be the most apparent, and implies that the narrator here is undergoing some sort of panic or duress and is now unable to trust really anyone. That or the narrator struggling to come to terms with the lack of morality of people around him. You'll meet a lot of people in your life, and while some of them are cool, you're bound to run into some moral question marks, people with no regard for society around them. As the song progresses, like I mentioned, it gets progressively more robust in sound. The instrumentation creates this panic, this almost disorientation about it, though. It's an incredibly unnerving listen, almost regardless of the lyricism. The only other lyric here I think worth mention is the relatively distorted verse towards the end of the song. One line is, "Fancy locks and cocks and rocks, stay inside, stay inside." Also kind of alluding to this paranoid feeling, I guess. This disorientation the rest of the track creates. It's not particularly a favorite of mine, but it's certainly an interesting part of the project. Let me rest in time while I blow your mind. Tried and true, an all-time classic from these Ween fellas, dare I say. A far more accessible track than you typically get from these guys, and one of their more successful mainstream songs because of it. A sort of alternative rock track, I suppose, leaning more in an acoustic direction than an electric one. The track begins with the narrator waking up. A woman approaches him, likely his ex-wife, which will be a major theme present throughout the remainder of this project. He says it's cool for you to love me now, and that he's everything. What does he mean by that? Perhaps it's a spiritual line, implying that with her love he feels connected to the universe, to the oneness, in a way. The chorus begins, he of course says the funny "smell my whole" line, but honestly, in spite of its fairly comedic execution, I find the chorus to be pretty sweet. It's a longing for love, to be truly known, to be fully understood by the woman he loves. For them to have dug through each other's souls, it's perhaps the purest connection we can find on this strange rock we all seem to be not flying off of in spite of its traveling at incomprehensible speeds. Sorry about that. I still don't really get it. The second verse begins with the line, "You bent the edge, eclipsed, and turned around, aligning. Through the dark sparked rays of violet light, blinding." To me, it's comparing his love to the moon, in a way that he views her as the light he found in his darkest times, the light that saved him, and through his connection with her he kind of healed. The bridge begins, "Rise, my dawn, you've been awake too long. Let me rest in time while I blow your mind." A fairly somber turn in the song, to be frank, a tone not really conveyed by the vocals here, but these lyrics are kind of tragic. As he begins to lose his wife, this dawn rises, the darkness begins, and now there's no moon to light the sky. He says he's fought this darkness long enough, and he prepares to rest, to let the night kind of consume him, and then Diener plays the fuck out of this guitar. Check this shit out. I couldn't play it that long, sorry. The final verse begins as the darkness seemingly confuses him. It's just a repeat of the first verse, so nothing too new here lyrically, but in the context of the light in his darkness being snuffed out, it comes across as much darker. Filled with a sense of grief now, a sense of loss, as he finds himself falling back into this darkness. Even so, he realizes creation, in a sense. He realized that he did this to himself. The fall of his relationship was at the very least partially on his shoulders. I didn't know it was that bleak, to be honest. Still a banger, though. Happy Colored Marbles. From that relatively straightforward track, we head back into the Ween rabbit hole with Happy Colored Marbles. A strange electronic, kind of industrial piece, I guess. Another relatively unclassifiable track, though. The track begins in this deeper voice. In my interpretation, I think it's meant to represent the narrator off of his medication. The verse begins, most people are not okay, but they're taking their siestas in the sun. He thinks most people are just as fucked up as he finds himself to be, and yet everyone just smiles and waves and puts on a brave face for their loved ones in spite of how they truly feel. They've got their ideas of the way things should be, and yet do nothing to create that change in their own life. They yearn for that peace, that serenity within themselves, and yet are afraid to truly face their own darkness. The chorus begins, and the vocals shift into this high-pitched voice, fairly reminiscent of something from Pure Guava. Happy colored marbles are rolling in my head. I put 'em back in the jacket of the one I love. Carry that velvet sack full of pretty colored marbles, and I'll ask you for 'em back when I'm ready and done. I came across two interpretations for this chorus. One implies the marbles are antidepressants. They kind of erase these dark thoughts he has, or at the very least buries them. And he keeps these marbles with the one he loves, in a way giving her control of his own happiness. The other interpretation I read suggested the marbles are representative of trauma and issues. As he spends time with his wife, he kind of gives her his trauma. After the relationship ended, he had to take the marbles back so he could give it to his next partner. I don't know, I like the first one more. The final verse begins as he reiterates what he said in the opening verse. People aren't okay. Everyone has their struggles, and he views them as slackers for not working to fix themselves, for not indulging in the happy-colored marbles. Filling up on the poison nut, perhaps a reference to the drugs he was taking, and then the chorus is repeated. But this time with a far more whimsical piece of production. It sounds far lighter in a way, more joyous. There's these background vocals just creating this vibe of almost serenity. The song concludes with an explosion of instrumentation, and the song leaves this whimsical sound for a far more intense industrial one. It sounds like the narrator here is overdosing. And in spite of 97% of the instrumentation having this heavy industrial sound, there's this strange synth in the background, as though there's still some part of him enjoying this. Even as he begins to die, somewhere in his mind he's content. A tragically bleak view into the cycle of addiction.
Hey there, fancy pants, play the songs that make us dance.
Hey There Fancypants. This is a very strange track on this record. Both the track preceding it and following it have a much darker sound to them, sonically at the very least. This track features a far more upbeat and simple melody, and far lighter production to back it all up. Lyrically, though, this track fits into this darker context better than I ever realized before writing this video. I always viewed this as a break from the chaos, but looking at the lyrics here, it stays right on theme with the addiction. The song begins with the chorus, a very light vocal performance here, almost painting a picture of optimism. To me, it sounds as though the chorus is the narrator distancing himself from his own thoughts, playing music in order to cope with his own sadness, a song for the lonely hearts, the shattered dreams and broken parts. As though through his music he was able to connect to these emotions in a way he was never able to before. That's why Quebec is such a magical album to me. It's so deeply personal, and in the chorus of this track, it's almost as though Gina is agreeing with that sentiment. That this album is a view directly into his psyche, as sporadic as it may be. The verse begins now under that hint of optimism portrayed throughout the track. To me, it sounds as though he's trying to convince himself that things can get better. In spite of his lack of belief in that possibility, he says, "Tonight's the night when all your dreams come true." He also says, "A do-do-do-do, root-to-do-doon, root-to-do-doon, ah." I'll leave that one for you to figure out. The final verse begins, now being more aggressive with the sorrow, I suppose. He's down in the dumps, drinking himself to death, feeling bad. He's at one of the lowest points in his life, and yet the instrumentation and even the vocals don't reflect that in the slightest. It portrays this almost surreal acceptance of this misery within him, as he says, "The rainbow ends with you. So sit on down and make yourself at home." As though he's starting to view these feelings and his addiction as himself, as permanent fixtures within his own life. He's comfortable here, and truly that's what makes this song so haunting. Through this upbeat melody, there's a piercing message of depression, of acceptance, and of kind of giving up on himself. Genuinely heartbreaking stuff. I always thought it was just a silly little song. Who would have thought? Captain. Off the back of that relatively roller coaster-like track, we head into Captain, a far more desolate track. Almost post-rockish in nature and very barren lyrically. Most of the lyrics are just, "Captain, turn around and take me home." Regardless of your interpretation up to this point, this song to me clearly comes off as kind of a cry for help, a wish to return to the way things once were, whether prior to his addiction or perhaps prior to his divorce. You pick, I don't know. Instrumentally, the guitar begins very sparsely, very few notes played at a very slow pace, as though he's still rising through something, whether it's his acceptance of his divorce or he's entering some sort of bad trip. Again, your pick. As the song progresses, the instrumentation gets increasingly faster, as though he's finally coming to terms with this reality he's facing, or as though this trip is taking some dark turn. Other than that, there's an incredibly distorted voice present, a voice so distorted that the internet isn't actually sure what's being said exactly. But as far as I can see, the voice says, "Blanket the lifeline, swathe me in mesh, the water, it's cold like when I kneel at death's gate. I'm a bringer of siege, a ground pig who awaits its master. A living monument to a fallen soldier, let me lie awake now and condense this fog into matter." I have no fucking idea what that means. Perhaps he finds himself as the destructive force in his own life. The thing that ruins everything around him is himself. As he condenses this fog into matter, in a way creating problems that arise in his own head, manifesting the despair around him with his own thoughts. Or he's on a lot of drugs.
Making time, breaking ground, sail bound day to chocolate.
Chocolate Town, heavily inspired by the... I was going to say beautiful, but I've actually been there. It's alright at best. Hershey, Pennsylvania. Said to be an autobiographical account by ex-band member Mean Ween. The track was inspired by the time Mr. Mean Ween was detained by police for trying to buy drugs in Hershey. Sonically, this is probably the most upbeat track on the project, a relatively standard acoustic rock track with some bluesy elements. Lyrically, the track is yet another downer. The song begins with the narrator tired of the life he was facing, perhaps ready to change or perhaps wallowing in his own misery, accepting his pain as was implied throughout the rest of the project. The chorus is another lyric of note, I suppose, as the narrator describes sailing the Brown Bay to Chocolate Town. From what I've read, it's either the fella's heading to Hershey to buy drugs, or Brown here is a metaphor for heroin, and the sailing of Brown Bay is riding the high of heroin. I don't think so. The third verse here discusses a reality check, I think. Someone tells the narrator that this lifestyle is killing him, that his addictions and his wallowing is ruining his life. The final verse begins perhaps with the narrator coming down from the high, a new breath. He feels the grip of the drugs releasing. And in this brief moment of sobriety, perhaps before the withdrawals kick in, he feels this sense of serenity. A quote, sunny bunny feeling. The song concludes with one last chorus mentioning the Greyhound bus to Chocolate Town, a reference to the bus the fellas would take to Hershey back in the day from New Hope. Cool little reference. Other than that, I think it's important to note that even though this entire album has been incredibly dark in nature, there's always been this optimistic shadow looming over every track. Whether on Happy Colored Marbles with the strange upbeat organ, or on Hey There Fancypants with its light and relatively upbeat instrumentation, there was always the sense of the narrator still believing he'd make it to the other side. From this point on, the album shifts into a far more pessimistic acceptance angle, I think, especially on the next track.
But I don't want it.
I Don't Want It. I Don't Want It is perhaps the most by-the-books love song ever heard from Ween. It's a song of grief, of longing, and most notably, acceptance. A quote from a 2003 Gene Ween interview reads, "A lot of these songs are actually about Sarah, who I was recently divorced from about 5 or 6 months ago. I'd been seeing her off and on since I was about 19, so a lot of those songs are about her. Kind of started off with Oh My Dear Falling in Love, and 15 years later it's ending with a song called I Don't Want It on Quebec. Truly, it's the culmination of almost everything Ween was about for so long. The joys of Sarah, Don't Laugh, I Love You, and Stay Forever. The sorrows of It's Gonna Be Alright and I'll Miss You. And all of those themes of love conclude in this masterpiece right here. The song begins with the narrator reflecting on his loss, how he yearns to lie in her arms, to go back to the way things once were, before his addiction and his depression. It's a pain that he's grown used to now every day since he lost her. He misses that safety he once had, the safety he threw away with the drugs. And yet the time passes, the spring goes by, then the fall, and he's still gone, still unable to accept what he's done to his love. She threw away the key, perhaps the key to his soul, to his heart. After years of trying to help him, she couldn't do it, and he understands that. He understands why she's leaving, but he can't accept it. He was a part of his life for so long, the moon that once illuminated his sky, the light that saved him from his darkness, and now she was gone. And for good this time. The next verse begins as the narrator reminisces on the good times they once shared together. He smiles back on those times. He can't believe how much things have changed, how far she's drifted from him, how far he's caused her to drift from him with his own actions. The chorus begins. Behind these vocals, there's a very soft vocal harmony, an almost angelic sound behind these words. Please hold on to the memories, he says, before we really crash and burn. Though it's been over for months now, he still can't really come to terms with what happened. He asks her to think back on all of the wonderful times they've shared, how happy they once were. They've got themselves so wrapped up that they've forgotten how to learn. In a sense, they've been married for so long that they've forgotten how to love each other. It's a brilliant moment of reflection from Gina where he finally seems to come to terms with it. That she doesn't love him anymore, and that his own addiction tore down the man he once was, and left him a husk in the eyes of his love. And yet he understands it. He understands how they've drifted this far apart. The song concludes with maybe just my favorite guitar solo of all time, the more that I think about it. As far as I know, it's the only guitar solo ever performed by Gina with Ween, as opposed to Diener. And I think it makes a lot of sense just based on how incredibly personal this track is to him. In my eyes, the guitar solo is his final goodbye to that relationship, a moment of acceptance from Mr. Gene Ween, a beautiful guitar solo where it almost sounds like the guitar itself is weeping for this death of love in his life, a death he caused with his own hands. It's tragic, it's heartbreaking, but most of all, it's the end of this chapter of his life, and I think the solo itself serves as the send-off to that chapter, the final piece of love we'd hear from Jeaner. It's haunting stuff. The Fuck Jam. I'd like to take a page out of the Vinyl Sleeves book and just say nope, but there might be a little more than meets the eye with the Fuck Jam. Wouldn't it be ear, though? A little more than meets the ear, but that doesn't sound as good. But I think it makes more sense. I'm just kidding, man. There's nothing here. I've read some people think the audio is Jeaner's voice incredibly distorted, and that he's discussing incredibly delicate and controversial issues on the state of Arab and Israel relations. I'm not touching that, dear viewer. Alcan Road. Alcan Road takes the soundscape back to an ambient-style track that sounds quite reminiscent of a desolate wasteland. The song is named after the Alaskan-Canadian highway, which runs from, well, Alaska to Canada, if you couldn't figure that one out yourself. Lyrically, the song seems to discuss traveling down the road, taking in the beauty around him, perhaps, or perhaps the narrator's being overwhelmed by psychedelic visuals traveling down the road. He sees seagulls, butterflies, some mountain man, eagles. It's a very disconnected track from the rest of the record in my eyes. Perhaps it's his mental state following I Don't Want It, a bleak view into his life following his divorce and the beauty he's attempting to find in the rest of the world. Though the music itself paints this picture of struggle in my mind, of trying to fix his life in meaningless ways rather than quitting drugs. Not the most important track on the record by any means, but it does lead into what I'd call the final act of the record. The last two tracks, quite honestly, two of the greatest songs I've ever heard in my young and hip life. The Argus. The Argus is an outlier on this record. Every other song has been relatively straightforward lyrically, even if they haven't been sonically. There hasn't been a lot of beating around the bush. This song's title derives from a rundown factory the fellas had passed by on their way to a studio in Hell, or more commonly known as New Jersey. The symbol they saw on the factory they described as satanic. The name of the place was Argus International, and that's where the idea derived from. The Argus in the song, however, is a reference to a mythical thousand-eyed beast from Greek mythology known as Argus Panoptes. A little background on that fella. It said Argus was Hera's servant. His great service to the Olympian pantheon was to slay the Chthontic, something like that, serpent-legged monster Echidna as she slept in her cave. Hera's defining task for Argus was to guard the white heifer Lo from Zeus, keeping her chained to the sacred olive tree at Arvige Heraeon. He charged him to tether this cow safely to an olive tree at Nemea. Hera knew that the heifer was in reality Lo, one of the many nymphs Zeus was coupling with to establish new order. To free Lo, Zeus had Argus slain by Hermes. Hermes, disguised as a shepherd, first put all of Argus's eyes asleep with spoken charms, then slew him by hitting him with a stone, the first stain of bloodshed among the new generation of gods. That was a lot, huh? Sonically, I'd argue this is the most beautiful song these two goofballs would ever create. Again, it's a song that's incredibly hard to categorize, but the beauty found here is genuinely indescribable. The first verse begins with sacrifice. Rather than portraying the Argus as some distant god, the lyrics seem to imply that it's far more intimate exchange than that, as though something tangible is being given up in sacrifice to this Argus. The phrase "fortune smiled upon us" implies to me that the sacrifice here was not in vain, and that perhaps by giving up a piece of himself, he was able to find peace within himself. The Argus throughout this track seems to be a source of guidance, of truth, and the sacrifice here may symbolize the cost of wisdom itself. The chorus begins with one of the most important lines on the track. The Argus is practiced compassion. This otherworldly figure is not defined by its authority or its power, but by its compassion and its guidance. The Argus here serves as a light at the end of this narrator's tunnel, a symbol of hope, a direction to take his life in. Will the God I grant his forgiveness and allow the he that's lived a reason to see? Perhaps implying that the Argus is giving his life meaning. That though he can't accept his own mistakes, were the Argus to forgive him, he could forgive himself. In the second verse, the narrator begins following this path drawn for him by the Argus, the signs that guide him forward. He feels as though he's been chosen. He sheds his old self, and at the end of the verse, he sees the Argus. The dark face with empty eyes, nothing like the narrator thought. This god figure he created in his own head turned out to be a terrifying creature. His empty eyes imply the lack of a soul, of morality itself. It implies that the Argus was merely a figurehead for the narrator to plant his beliefs on, a divine being of his own creation to rationalize his own choices. The chorus is repeated, with only the final line being changed this time. Droplets of light now erupt from the sea. Perhaps the narrator had come to terms with the Argus. A genuinely jaw-dropping breakdown ensues, and the song heads towards its conclusion with its final verse. The first couple lines are references to the Argus's own death I touched on earlier, his eyes all closed as he sleeps. In this sleep, we enter the Argus's own point of view. He dreams of having lived a better life, of having served mankind in a better way. He sees the confusion around him, and he doesn't understand it. People sacrifice their livelihoods, their own morals, to appease this otherworldly beast. And upon this realization, the Argus cries. Though love has its own place in the sun, it's only man's fear that carries him on. Though love is the true purpose of this life, to connect with someone on a soul level, mankind moves because of fear. Fear of not fitting in, of dying alone, of being inadequate. It's an incredibly warped way to live life that almost everyone you know lives like. A haunting piece to set up the conclusion of this masterpiece.
If you could save yourself, you'd save.
If you could save yourself, you'd save us all. Though the rest of the record seems to take place right around the divorce, I view this song as a view kind of from the future, looking into the past. Sonically, the song is very reminiscent of a carnival. It's got that circus sound to it. I'm not really sure how else to explain it. But it's also got this underlying sense of beauty in it. The first verse begins with the narrator seemingly people-watching. He sees someone holding hands with his wife as he heads back towards his empty house. He empties his suitcase and looks out into the world, and then the chorus ensues. If you could save yourself, you'd save us all. Perhaps saying that finding peace within yourself is the key to connection. The key to love itself, perhaps, is loving yourself. To persevere through your own hardships and come out the other side with acceptance for yourself. And this message is one the narrator struggles to understand. It's an incredibly simple concept, and it truly puts everything into perspective for him. The time he spent working himself to death, to care for her, to be there for her, to make her happy, to get her through life, that's not what she wanted. What she wanted was for him to be happy, to experience that joy together, that joy they once shared, and the joy the band shared with us on tracks like Stay Forever and Sarah. He says he was on his knees when you knocked me down, as though he was already aware of how damaged he was, and the divorce was this final nail in the coffin for him. The next verse begins with the funny come line. I'm going to try to make it serious for some reason, if you'll excuse me. The verse describes his relationship falling apart, or maybe even his life. The checks bounced, his relationship was falling apart, his drug addiction was ruining his life. And he ends the verse with the line, I left you a note, but I wrote it in disappearing ink. To me, it means that he wanted to fix the relationship. He wanted to tell his wife how he felt, how broken he had become, but he couldn't do it. As if the note had just disappeared. The song concludes with the chorus once again, but this time the vocals are completely different. In the first chorus, they were delivered fairly calmly, but the second chorus has this far more passionate delivery.
If you could save yourself, you'd save.
As though he's finally breaking down, realizing how simple it could have been if he would have helped himself. If he would have fought through the drug withdrawals and the pain, come out the other side, he may still have his wife to lighten his sky. I think here he concludes this project with true acceptance. The time he wasted pretending to be okay, to keep pushing through his addiction without changing anything. The life he lost because of it. Here in this final chorus, I think he's accepted it. An incredibly poetic conclusion to a project so incredibly personal. And goddamn magical. Now that's all I got. Subscribe if you enjoyed, maybe. See you in the next one. Peace.